session. Thank you, Ariana. So the objectives of the session are to first define what are case reports and case series, and we've already heard some examples of what they could look like. We will cover their strengths and limitations, and also we'll go through some examples of case reports and case series and how they can be used to contribute to epidemiological understanding, particularly in the topic of occupational epidemiology. So case reports. So we've already heard some examples today of what is a case report. So this is a definition from the Dictionary of Epidemiology. Probably many of you have a copy of this. And so here the Dictionary of Epidemiology describes it as detailed descriptions of a few patients, usually just one patient, usually with an unusual disease, an uncommon combination of diseases, or an unusual case or outcome. And then the definition later says that they are often preliminary observations that are later refuted, and they cannot estimate disease frequency or risk because we don't have a valid denominator. We only have that case person. But there's other definitions of case reports as well. This is the definition from the National Cancer Institute that talks about a case report being a detailed report of the diagnosis, treatment, or follow-up of an individual patient, so one patient. And then the definition notes that usually the case reports contain some demographic information about the patient. So usually the patient is described in terms of their age, their gender, their ethnic origin, or other characteristics. And there's other definitions in the literature that you can find as well. And then to contrast the case report to the case series, here the case series goes up from usually just one person contained in the case report to more than one person contained in the case series. So here again, the Dictionary of Epidemiology defines case series as a collection of subjects with common characteristics and usually some aspect of a disease, an exposure, or a procedure is described. And again, the National Cancer Institute here also refers to case series as being usually a group or series of case reports involving more than one patient. Again, they usually contain some sort of demographic information about the patient, and there could be information on their diagnosis, treatment, response to treatment, or follow-up after treatment. I see one hand up. Darja, would you like to ask a question?
No, Michelle, I'm sorry. It's
okay.
From a previous question.
Okay, that's okay. So that's an old hand, that's fine. Okay, so I'll keep going then. So this is one example of a case series that is often referred to in occupational epidemiology. It was one of the readings in the Moodle, so I hope some of you have had a chance to take a look at it. So this case series is often cited as the first report of a possible association between asbestos and mesothelioma. And it describes, I think, 33 people that have mesothelioma, and it describes their linkages with possible exposure to asbestos. Many of them had worked in asbestos mines. You can see here they mentioned 23 out of the 33 participants had worked in mines. Some did not. Some had asbestos exposure, for example, through transport or processing of asbestos, or perhaps some had asbestos at home as well, or through their residential exposure, perhaps bystander exposure from a spouse working in a mine, for example. So this publication is from 1960, and it's set in South Africa. And so I was kind of curious to hear from all of these students online, what were your kind of impressions when you were going through this publication? Were there any aspects of the case series that you found surprising to you, that you found interesting? I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this report. Is there anyone who would like to volunteer to give an initial kind of impression about this paper? So initial impression. So I'll continue, but please feel free to. I'll ask you again a little bit later what you thought when you were reading this case report. And please also feel free. Okay, one person apologizes they didn't read it, but maybe you'll be more motivated to read it after this lecture, hopefully. So here we have this case report. And in this case report, you will see detailed descriptions of the case histories of many of these 33 participants. So here again, just like the definitions we covered at the beginning of the lecture, you can see that the case report talks about, whether the case was male or female, their age, gives a fairly detailed description about their job, where they were born, how they were exposed to asbestos, gives a very detailed description of their kind of clinical experience, how they were diagnosed, their treatment, and also their current vital status. Many of the participants here, unfortunately, had died by the time this report was published. So it's a fairly detailed description, and then they have this table here in the publication that also summarizes all 33 of the cases. It provides information on their year of birth, their age of diagnosis, race, sex, whether they were born in this area in South Africa where the asbestos is found. And it also gives a fairly detailed summary of all of the asbestos exposure history of these 33 people. And then information about their kind of clinical experience and then their survival. And so this case report was a very influential report for different reasons. And it's often, referred to in the literature as being, an important report in terms of the knowledge on asbestos and mesothelioma. And, one of the reasons why this case report was influential and why case reports can be interesting is, here we're looking at a very rare cancer that doesn't occur very much at all in the study area. Just like Manolis was talking about on Tuesday, he was talking about how in one factory there were four cases of a very rare cancer observed, whereas, in the entire United States, you would only expect 25. So here case reports can often be very informative in terms of very rare cancers or very rare outcomes that have very few known risk factors. And that makes these initial case reports fairly credible. And then later, a larger number of case control and cohort studies were later conducted on this topic and did confirm an association between asbestos and mesothelioma. And now the causal association is very well established. So, when I was reading the case report, something that I also thought was useful here in terms of, the authors going to this large effort and documenting so much detailed information about the participants. I thought it was also interesting, just to have this documented from a historical perspective. So this is a case report from 1960. There are also other case reports published, from the 1800s on very interesting topics. So without those published reports, we wouldn't have that accessible historical perspective on a lot of these very rare exposures or rare outcomes. The case report, there was an amazing amount of detail, I thought, in terms of the level of how the investigators investigated the exposure experience of the participants here. to asbestos. They even mentioned concepts about latency was mentioned several times in the case report. I was very detailed, talked about asbestos exposure in both occupational and non-occupational settings. And then just as, Bendik was mentioning earlier, it also attempts to put together, a solid hypothesis and presents information on animal data, and it cites reports in other populations. So it's really building, a hypothesis around this potential association at that time. So are there any other comments from anybody on this case series here? There's one hand from Susanna. Please go ahead, Susanna.
Thank you, Michelle.
This lecture. Thank you. So here's another example. So this is an example about bladder cancer. So here we have 10 cases of bladder cancer in male Japanese workers exposed to orthotoluidine. So this case series was published in 2018. And so this paper talks about these workers who are working in the dye industry. And it describes the production process here and describes how most workers, I think, are involved in the drying and distillation of this whole process, which involves different types of solvents and different types of exposures to the workers. And so you'll see this table 1 is kind of a main summary of the information contained in this case report. So this was a case report that focused mainly on orthotoluidine here, which is this first line, OT. So these are the 10 bladder cancer cases. And these numbers here are a type of number, kind of a surrogate level of exposure that they calculated for these 10 workers exposed to orthotoluidine. And so these 10 workers, they were exposed between 1987 and 1997. They were mainly working in drying and packing of these dyes and pigments at 2 different plants in Japan. And so I was reading this case series last year because we were doing some work on another agent called orthoanisidine. So you'll see here, that's one of the 6 other agents that these workers can be exposed to. So that's this one here. So we were interested in this agent. You can see that there are 3 of the bladder cancer cases that were exposed to the agent that we were interested in. They also calculated a type of surrogate indicator of exposure here. And so they also have information about the smoking status, the pack years for each of these 10 bladder cancer cases, and information on their past history of urinary tract diseases, and also their symptoms at diagnosis of bladder cancer. So, is this case report useful? Here we're interested in orthoanisidine. If anybody has any comments. So we're interested in these 3 workers, and we're interested to know if their orthoanisidine exposure, if there's any information in this case series that could, be informative as we're thinking about the association between orthoanisidine and bladder cancer. If anybody has any initial thoughts, let me know. If not, I will proceed. Yes. Okay. Well, why exposed to Thank you. We're also exposed to orthotoluidine, which is already classified as a group 1 agent for in humans for bladder cancer. And as we already mentioned, 2 out of the 3 workers were also exposed to tobacco smoke, which is also a group 1 agent for bladder cancer. So there, we don't have any orthoanisidine workers here without high levels of exposure to other group 1 agents. But despite that, for the other reasons we said, including, documenting historical perspective, documenting, the complex exposure circumstances that workers often find themselves in. It's also an interesting report to go through. They also, in this paper, if you want to download it later and read, they also talk about latency. They also provide a lot of information about route of exposure. As well as they document the types of personal protective equipment that the workers may or may not have been using in their jobs. And so as part of this case series, the authors also talk about them documenting this information and how it can be useful for screening of similar types of workers in the future. And also in terms of supporting different types of, preventative efforts in workers, because they were describing how a lot of the workers had very, insufficient levels of PPE use when they were working with these types of chemicals. So for all those reasons, I think it's still a very interesting report to go through. Okay, so I also think it's very interesting that IARC also considers case reports and case series in their evaluations. They're usually considered only in very kind of exceptional circumstances because they do have many limitations that we've already talked about. But it is written in kind of, this is the kind of instructions about how IARC monographs are conducted. And it specifically notes that case reports and case series in humans can also be considered as part of a cancer evaluation in a monograph. And they note in the preamble that, in fact, many early discoveries of occupational cancer hazards came about by these first initial observations, by workers and by clinicians here. And as Susanna mentioned, that sometimes these case reports and case series can be a very good starting point for more structured investigation. Sometimes when the risk is high enough, sometimes the case series by itself can provide compelling evidence for an association. These instances are fairly unusual, but it does happen. And this is one example where two main case series provided sufficient information about exposure to this agent and cancer risk. So this is this example here, example number 3. So there were these two case series that were published in very high impact journals. And so these were case series. So I think these were both conducted in Belgium. And I think it was around the 1990s. It was mainly women who were taking a type of weight loss pill containing some different herbs. And it was causing a very serious kidney disease. And many of these women had, very, very serious illnesses and needed to have their kidneys removed and have kidney transplants or be on dialysis for a long time. I guess at some point in the manufacturing of these pills, there was an inadvertent replacement. And this ingredient here was inadvertently included in the pills. And based on animal studies, it was known to be carcinogenic in animals. And so these two groups of investigators, what they did is they identified mainly women who were undergoing kidney transplants and very, very kind of advanced kidney disease and had their kidneys removed. And they found in a very large proportion of these women that they did find evidence for cancer in these kidneys that were removed. And so, again, there were no control groups in either study. We just had the case series of these women with a very advanced kidney disease. But in both series, the use of these herbs, all of the women with the advanced kidney disease use these herbs for weight loss. Also, there was also an absence of other exposures that were leading. Was it bladder cancer? I think here was the endpoint? Yeah. So there was kind of an absence of other common exposures that caused the endpoint here. And also these were young women around, I think the mean age was around 40 or 50 years old. And normally in this age group, there's a very low prevalence of cancer in this age group. So and also a very strong temporal association. So they knew that the women had taken these pills. They even had information on their prescriptions from their doctors. And so they had a very kind of strong temporal association in these two studies. And so combining all of those factors together, the IARC working group here decided that these studies were enough to determine that there is a causal association between the use of these herbs and this advanced disease, including urothelial cancer. So that's a very kind of rare example, but it does happen. Okay, so we're going a little bit late on time, so I'm going to skip this other example using the same bladder cancer study. And so some of the positives of case reports and case series, we've already talked about many of these. They include first identifying a concern or a new disease, establishing a hypothesis or new ideas, stimulating further research, progressing scientific education. And, together when you form a hypothesis, including the information from these case series and case reports, it may support a causal assessments. There are definitely negatives, though, including the fact that there's no denominator or no comparison group. We only have the cases. There may be questions about selection biases. There may be some confounding as well that are important concerns to remember. And then this is, I think, one of the last slides. And I just wanted to point out, in case anybody wants to put together a case report or case series, that there are reporting guidelines here, which tells you, gives you an idea about, things that you should include in your manuscript, including in the title. You should include the word case report or case study in the title, and all sorts of other information that should be detailed in the paper. And I thought the one thing that's kind of very different from other types of epidemiological studies that we publish is, you'll see down here at the bottom, the reporting guidelines specifically mention that the patient perspective should also be included. So the patient should share their perspective or experience wherever possible, which is also very, very unique. And also makes it very interesting. So that's the lecture for case reports and case series. I'll stop sharing my screen. And now we could take if there's any other major comments or questions, we can take them now.